Hello book people, P.T. Hilton here with the first installment of the Dream Readalong, where we are reading Sandman. Today we'll be discussing the first collection, which is called Preludes and Nocturnes. It is issues 1 through 8, and we will be having lots of spoilers, so if you haven't read it yet, go ahead and save this video for later and come back when you have. So before we get into the story itself, I want to talk a little bit about the origin of how Sandman, the comic book, came to be. So Neil Gaiman was a British comic book writer who is pretty unknown to American audiences for the most part, and he wrote a miniseries called Black Orchid for DC Comics along with the artist Dave McKean, who did the artwork, and DC loved it. They were sure it was going to be a big hit, so they decided to put it out in their prestige format, which was basically like thicker paper, better quality binding and stuff like that, better quality stuff, and it's actually a lot like what all comic books are today. Back then, most comic books were printed on newsprint, pretty low quality stuff, and so it was more expensive to put it on the prestige format with the better paper and all that. So DC said to Dave McKean and Neil Gaiman, look, we know this is going to be a hit, but it's very expensive to put these out, so we want you to do something else first to kind of get your name out there a little bit. So they put Dave McKean on Arkham Asylum with Grant Morrison, which was a graphic novel that became a huge hit. And then they told Neil Gaiman, why don't you do a monthly series? What would you like to do a monthly series about? And he listed all these different characters, and they kept saying, no, that character's being used by X writer, that character's going to be in this team or whatever. Finally, it came to Sandman, which he was talking about the 1970s superhero Sandman, which was kind of a character who wore a gas mask and had a gun that shot like sleeping gas, basically. And he said he'd do a comic about them, and the editor said, great, you can do that. And he started working on it, but the next day they called him back and they said, actually, that character is being used in a different book. Could you maybe just create a new character with that same name, Sandman, and do that? So he agreed to do that. And I'm sure they were expecting like some similar type of character that was also a crime fighter, maybe, the original Sandman's nephew or something like that. DC Comics always does that kind of thing. But instead he went for a completely different direction, as you know. The idea of getting this monthly series that didn't have huge expectations behind it was very freeing to him, and he was able to experiment a lot and try some different things, which he definitely did. So let's get into the story a little bit. By the way, as we go through this, I'm going to be, a lot of the information that I'm sharing I got from the book The Sandman Companion by Hy Bender, which is basically a series of really in-depth interviews with Neil Gaiman where they go kind of storyline by storyline and talk about a lot of things. One thing I want to say right off the bat is that this collection is a little bit different than the rest of the Sandman series. The rest of the Sandman series is, I would say, a little bit more character-driven than this stuff. This is a little bit more of a like the structure of it, even though there's lots of crazy stuff happening, the structure of it, is a pretty fairly normal story. It's like, the hero loses these 3 things that are important to him and has to go hunt them down and find them. So from that aspect, it's very, story driven. He goes, finds one thing, finds the next thing, finds a third thing, and that's basically the story, right? I think you can really look at, if you're on the fence about whether you want to continue with the series, you can look at the last issue, the issue where Death shows up, is kind of a way to gauge whether you're interested in reading the rest, because that's very much more of a character-driven story, and I think the rest of the series is a little bit more like that, where there's not like driving of a narrative necessarily in all the different storylines. It's more exploring interesting ideas and interesting characters, and while there are stories that happen for sure, it's more about ideas than characters. Let's talk about the first words. What great first words, right? The first line is "Wake up." I think it's actually "Wake up, sir," but "Wake up." What a great opening for a story about Dream, right? There's some things that work in this for me and some things that don't, this first arc. Things that work for me, I really like the first issue and that whole storyline. I think they do an excellent job of setting up this whole world and this really complex series of ideas in one issue, and putting a story in there too to keep it interesting. I love all the stuff in the dreaming in the second issue. What doesn't work for me as much was the John Constantine stuff. I didn't dig that much. And some of the superhero stuff that is in there, like when the whole thing with Scott Free where he's in there and Martian Manhunter. When this series started, it was very much in the DC universe, and as the series progressed, eventually Vertigo became a Vertigo title, and kind of distances itself from the normal DC superhero universe. But it's interesting to see that in this first volume, they're referring to a lot of just the normal DC superhero universe type stuff. And that stuff didn't work for me as well, so I'm glad that they distanced themselves from that a little bit later. One interesting thing I did not know when I first read this was issue 2, where they go to the dreaming, and you have some of my favorite characters show up for the first time. Cain, Abel, Eve, the 3 witches, Lucian, that whole thing. I didn't realize that all of those characters that I just named are from 1970s DC, or even before, I think 50s to 70s DC horror comics. So, for instance, Cain and Abel respectively hosted House of Mystery and House of Secrets. And I don't remember which did which, but if you think of like Tales from the Crypt with the Crypt Keeper, that was the kind of role they had, where they'd be kind of framing the story at the beginning and end. And it's kind of funny, Abel's whole deal was that he was often telling these stories to his wife, who he's always acted really scared of, who kind of browbeat him, it seemed like, in the stories or whatever. But the kind of little twist at the end was always that she doesn't actually exist. She was just like an imaginary wife, but her name was Goldie. So it was kind of cute that at the end of issue 2 he named the gargoyle Goldie, and Goldie goes on to be great in the series as well. But I think it's interesting the way that right away at the beginning we see Neil Gaiman dealing with all sorts of stuff similarly. Like he takes everything from all the Paradise Lost and Dante's Inferno references in the issue where Sandman goes to hell, and these crazy characters from 1970s horror comics. He treats them both like with equal respect, right? Which is a thing that we'll see again and again throughout this series. He takes stuff, even the silliest stuff from comic book history, and treats it very seriously and puts a unique and very interesting spin on it. Speaking of when he went to hell, we also got a very interesting little tidbit there where we saw Nadia, which apparently is a long-lost love of Sandman's, which we learned there he has condemned to hell. And we start to see the interesting kind of like moral dichotomy of Morpheus, in that he's apparently like condemned this woman he loves to hell, which is of course horrible. We don't know why, we don't know what she did or anything, but then later, John Dee, after all the crazy stuff that he does, Sandman basically just puts him back in Arkham, doesn't give him the punishment that maybe he deserves. So we're starting to see some interesting aspects of Morpheus's character right away. Speaking of John Dee, one of the issues that really affected me when I first read this as a teenager was that 24 Hours in a Diner storyline. I'll be honest, on this reread, I was a little bit more like, man, that's kind of over the top. It didn't work quite as well for me as I remember, but it was partly because it blew my mind so much when I read it as a teenager. I just love that whole idea of taking this 24-hour day and just giving us little tiny snippets throughout the day and letting the reader kind of just letting their imagination fill in the rest. And that's something that I think had a profound impact on me. In my book, Regulation IT, I do something where I have a chapter called 7 Nights in Rook Mountain that's similar, where you're just checking in like once each night and all this crazy stuff in the town is going on. So I love that method of storytelling, and it affected me in a big way. The other thing I love in that issue was the whole thing with the waitress who's a writer. Neil Gaiman says in that Sandman companion book that is the closest, like the captions about her writing is the closest he ever came in the series to just like out and out saying what the series was about, saying the theme of the series. And I think it's nicely kind of hidden almost, that if you haven't read the whole thing, you won't see that. It's also kind of where we first start to see that this is a story about stories. And that we'll see that again and again throughout the series, that the story is kind of the point. Like the story is not just the method, it's the destination. The story is the goal unto itself, and the value of stories is a huge thing in this series. Finally, in the last issue, of course, we have the introduction of death, and I've already talked about that, but man, that was great to see one of the Endless, and I get excited every time one of the Endless is introduced. So those are my thoughts. I want to hear what you think, so go ahead and leave your comments below, and we will continue the conversation. Next week, we'll be reading Volume 2, The Doll's House. I will talk to you then. Bye.